So based on what we've talked about, we're basically left with, again, that experimental, quasi-experimental, or non-experimental design. The experimental, we have a full manipulation of the IV. We're completely in control of whatever that variable is, and we are determining how people are being assigned, usually using random assignment into groups. Quasi-experimental, we might have basically only partial control over the IV. In other words, we can't use random assignment. We may be choosing different levels, but those levels may also represent different populations. So a lot of research that we're interested in is quasi-experimental. If we're interested in the differences between people from different generations, if we're interested in differences between various genders, if we're interested in different cultures, that can't be manipulated directly. We can take control and say that our independent variable is going to be, for example, male, female, or non-binary. However, that's partial control. We're deciding what to look at, but we can't use random assignment. Either it's impractical, impossible, or unethical. Non-experimental design, there is no random assignment, and we're not manipulating the IVs. We're simply looking at the differences in those IVs. So again, we're going to look at, for example, the relationship, for instance, with eating and health. So how healthy you're eating versus your overall health, that would be a non-experimental design. We are not doing really partial. We've chosen variables, but that's all. We haven't actually used random assignment. We're not manipulating. We're even making choices in the differences. We're simply looking for patterns. So anyway, broadly speaking, again, our goal, if we're looking at pure internal validity, is going to be the experimental design. Full manipulation of the independent variable, control of all other possible variables, and the use of random assignment. However, depending on what we're interested in researching, we are going to be simply trying to get as close to that goal as we can, and sometimes we may not be that close, and depending on what we're interested in actually looking at. So the experimental design, we have full manipulation of the independent variable, we have random assignment in a group. Our strength here is control. We're holding all other variables as stable as is possible with the tools that we have. If we do find a relationship between the variables within the study, our internal validity is very strong. We can make a claim that what we manipulated did indeed have an effect on what we measured. But the weakness is realism. True experimental studies, everyone in that study knows they're in an experiment because they came to an experiment and they were randomly assigned and conditioned, which also means they, at least to somewhat degree, know that there's conditions and that they're in one of them. They know they're being observed, they know they're part of a study, and that's really not a very good representation, if you want to generalize back to the populace, of how people behave in the quote-unquote real world. So that's the biggest weakness, is that realism, or the ability to generalize externally. Descriptive studies are research involving measured variables to describe behavior. There's no examination of the causal relationship between those variables, but we can still learn a lot about what's going on. And these can include surveys, observations, and case studies. And we're going to talk about all three of those, by the way, the types of descriptive studies. So survey research, observation, which includes behavioral content and archival data, and case studies, all ways to still learn about human behavior that are not necessarily true experiments or causal. So survey or questionnaire research is probably one of the most common tools used in the study of human behavior, both from psychology to history to sociology to sometimes even philosophy. And these can include, like I said, the most common technique with human participants. Participants typically are responding to a survey or questionnaire about their thoughts, about their feelings, about their attitudes, or even self-reporting their behaviors. Often the responses can be yes, no. They can be categorical responses, single, married, divorce, basically letting people sort themselves into potential categories, which could be used as independent variables. They can also be scales, so we could get to those continuous variables we were talking about. So how happy are you? Not at all to very happy on a 0 to 8 scale, for instance. All of these provide various types of variables. And again, we want to ask ourselves, is the questions we're asking matching the variables to what we're interested in actually studying? So if all I'm interested in is whether or not you are currently in a relationship or not, I might not want to actually ask about single, married, or divorced. I might simply want to ask, are you currently in a relationship? Yes or no. If I'm interested in comparing differences between those that are currently in a relationship, currently not in a relationship, are in a long-term relationship, or are previously in a long-term relationship that has now failed, those might be the questions I want to ask. Notice that single, married, divorced, you see this a lot. What does divorced mean? I'm divorced, but I'm also in a long-term married relationship. Wife 2.0, I refer to her. She likes that. Wife 1.0 probably doesn't, but that's why I never call wife 1.0 1.0. So again, you want to ask, are we asking the right questions in a way that's meaningful to what we're actually researching? We can also simply have free response, so more qualitative. They write in anything they want. We can get qualitative information from this method too. So again, just recognize that there's a lot of tools here we can use when we're doing non-experimental survey or questionnaire research. The topic can be obvious or hidden, and it's a lot of times the topic of the research is fairly obvious when you look at a survey or questionnaire research, but there are ways to potentially mask what you're interested in, including asking questions you're not interested in purposely to kind of throw off the scent. And this can help to make it more realistic. So for example, if I'm reading a questionnaire and it's clear they're wanting to basically measure an ism in me, let's call it sexism. They're wanting to find out how sexist I am. And every question is about my attitudes towards various gender issues and people working based on their gender. And it's very clear that that's what they're measuring. If I want to be socially conscious, if I want to project myself in a positive way, I may not share my actual attitudes. I may share the attitudes that I think are socially responsible that people would expect me to believe. So therefore, that survey, though it's gathering information, may not gather the information as honestly as they're wanting it to. Likewise, another way you could potentially do this is you could actually ask questions that are unrelated to sexism and only have a few items scattered through. It's a little less obvious what you're actually trying to get me to measure, and I might be more honest in my responses. Now, recognize that this, again, is a kind of seesaw, that to truly hide what you're interested in, you're going to have to ask a lot of questions and make a very long survey of a lot of data you're not interested in, which you may also get survey fatigue or people just stopping to take your survey because they don't want to keep answering all these questions. So it's something, again, you have to kind of weigh. How important is it to conceal what I'm actually interested in researching? So like I said, most often participants may know or at least think they know about your topic when you're doing survey or questionnaire research. So the next type of study we could look at is observational research. And there's two types here, basically, broadly speaking: natural observation and contrived. Natural observation means that you're observing human behavior in its natural setting. People don't know they're in your study. You're quietly observing their behavior, whether it's hidden cameras, whether it's you simply taking notes. You're watching real world behavior. Contrived means that you're still watching real behavior, but they know they're in a lab, but you're trying to put them at ease, or maybe even conceal what you're actually researching to hopefully get their real behavior. It's good for research that may be unethical to manipulate or behaviors that can't be easily disrupted. Now, the downsides here is subjective interpretations. So you are having to get basically someone has to determine whether the behavior happens or not and what level that behavior happens at. A lot of times these studies will involve multiple raters all trained on how to actually rate the behaviors, and then they'll look for that inter-rater reliability. Probably one of the most famous examples of an observational contrived study is Bandura's Bobo doll study, where he brought children in to a waiting room, supposedly waiting to take part in another study, and he then provided a basically inflate doll that you could punch. Now, his manipulation in this, and he did manipulate something, and that was whether or not the children watched an adult punch the doll or not. In other words, it was an experiment looking at would the children emulate an adult behavior. And what they found was that if the adult did not come into the room and punch the doll, very few children went over and started to beat on the Bobo doll. However, if while the children were waiting for the supposed real experiment, an adult came in and bashed the doll, which are those first two pictures at the top of the slide here, then the children were very likely to do the same behavior when left alone, not knowing they were being observed. Content analysis is another way that we can gather information about human behavior without bringing people into a lab and without them knowing they're being observed. We're basically not observing people directly. We're observing what they produce, the content. So we can do content analysis of books, movies, TVs, and other media. And these can be both quantitative, looking for themes in those movies, TVs, or books, and it can also be quantitative, where we're actually trying to just count behaviors. So some examples of things that we could do in content analysis, for instance, is, for example, we could look at the differences in how marriages are portrayed in TV shows from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, etc. So how is our media reflecting our attitudes towards behavior about marriage? Now, again, we could also just observe marriages, so a contrived or observational study, or we could definitely send out questionnaires and ask people about marriage. Content analysis is just another way we can kind of gather information about human behavior. We could also look at how women are portrayed in movies from different eras. So from the damsel in distress of the 30s to the action adventure stars of the 80s and 90s, for instance. So again, we're not necessarily measuring individuals or asking them to fill out surveys, but we are also gathering information about how gender roles, for instance, have changed as represented in the content of our media. So do be careful that when we're actually talking about content analysis, we're also not necessarily getting a direct representation, we're getting an idealized representation. And sometimes that representation has more to do with the uniqueness or the interest. So this is actually a quick, this is actual data drawn from a cartoon called XKCD, I believe. And this was a Google result search. So skydiving had I died in a blank accident. Died in a skydiving accident, there was 710 hits. Elevator accident, 575 hits. Surfing, 496. Skateboarding, 473. Camping, 166. Gardening, 100. Ice skating, 94. Knitting, 7. Blogging, 2. So based on this content analysis, you would assume that skydiving is by far the most dangerous of these events. And there is a fair amount of danger in skydiving, don't get me wrong. But if you actually look at the number of people that skydive versus the number that are seriously injured every year, skydiving is actually a very relatively safe occupation, if you will, or pastime. Actually, surfing and skateboarding and camping all have a greater injury rate than skydiving does. But we're not really impressed by finding out that someone that was surfing hit their head or drowned. We are pretty impressed that someone went skydiving and that chute didn't open, which means that we are more likely to click on those stories, we're more likely to read those stories, which also means that our media knows it's more likely to present those stories because those are stories that we find more interesting. So just recognize that when we do content analysis, there is some limitations there. Archival research is basically, we're no longer using the content of our media or the art that we're creating, we're using records or existing data. So we're assuming that the data is relatively reliable, that it is reflecting reality, historical records, newspaper accounts, vital records, birth and death, medical histories or medical records, voter registration and poll results, academic records, things that we think that we can pretty much trust. Then we have to ask the right questions. So again, a lot can be learned from looking at historical records as well. Now, I want to make the distinction, the way this is different than content analysis is content is usually looking at the art or creations of human behavior. Archival research has basically the same rigor as if we were doing the study ourselves. So if I was actually interested in looking at GPA non-archivally, I would want to get actual GPA scores. If I was looking at it archivally, I would actually try to get the old records of previous GPA scores. And again, we can find that archival research has found a fair amount of information. So the risk of cancer from radiation and asbestos, etc., is from archival research. It wasn't done by exposing people to radiation and seeing if they died. It was a correlational study looking at medical records and whether or not people that were getting cancer had also had exposure to various types of radiation. Same effect of asbestos. Schwartz and Bartsky in 1977 did a massive research looking at the extent of home team advantage in all sports. And they found across 20 plus years of sports records, and these were all, again, newspaper reports of wins and losses, and they simply asked, was the person playing home team? And they found across all sports there was a slight advantage to home team advantage, about a 54% chance of winning compared to 46% when you're not on your home field. Carl Smith and Anderson in 1979 correlated occurrences of urban riot to daily temperature records and found indeed one of the biggest predictors of people in general behaving violently and unlawfully is discomfort. In other words, if it's 70 and nice out, riots usually don't occur. Riots occur when it's unpleasant. And also, of course, a lot of different types of music have been accused of being involved with suicide. there has been archival studies that have actually found the only type of music that's really associated with depressive behaviors and suicide isn't heavy metal. That's what the media loves to come after. It's actually country music and folk music. Now, does that mean country music causes suicide and those people that listen to country music are going to commit suicide? Probably not. Again, these are not experimental causal studies. Do people that live in more rural areas and make less money listen more likely to country music? I can tell you when I lived in Indianapolis, a major metropolitan center, I had access to pretty much every type of music. I then moved to a small horse farm in southwest Indiana, and I have one radio station. It only plays country music. And where I live is not necessarily, shall we say, the social economic status of a lot of the people live in that area is not very good, which means that it may simply be an illusionary correlation. There's something else going on. It may be social economic status is a bigger predictor, or lack of job prospects is a bigger predictor, which also happens to correlate potentially with folk and country music. And finally, we have the case study. A case study is a focus on a single event, person, or group. It's not trying to necessarily generalize. It's trying to truly understand a particular behavior as the first step of maybe continuing further studies. And I think probably one of the best examples of this is when we're looking at a new or rare phenomenon. And I may have mentioned this in the Do You Want to Know More lecture. So Carl Festinger, when he was interested in creating, and actually he didn't start out wanting to create a theory of cognitive dissonance, he started wondering why people would stay in a doomsday cult once the doomsday didn't happen. And he actually investigated by joining a doomsday cult. The cult leader there is to the right, Festinger is to the left. And his initial study was a case study. It looked at simply what happened in this cult when the cult leader claimed that on a particular day, everyone on the world would die and they would be taken up into space, and it didn't happen. And the study is called When Prophecy Fails. Now, as he reflected on what he saw in this case study, he started to create a theory of cognitive dissonance, that it's easier to change our attitude than it is to change our behaviors. And that's cognitive dissonance at its most basic level. The idea that once you've done an outward behavior that suggests how you feel, it's a lot easier to change how you feel than to own up to the bad decision. So if you have given away all of your belongings to join a doomsday cult, and it turns out that it was provably a dumb idea, you either have to agree, I did something dumb, or you double down, well, the cult still is good, and they just made a mistake, and I'm sure they'll be right next time. Because that's easier to deal with as an individual human, and that's cognitive dissonance. That when we have a difference, a dissonance between our cognitions, our thoughts and our feelings, and our behaviors, it's easier to change our thoughts and our feelings than it is to change past behaviors. It's not the only path, but it's one that comes up. So again, that would also be an example of a non-experimental study that led eventually to very experimental studies that truly showed that this is a tendency in human behavior.